So I'm going to supply a few reasons as to why I think having a 6-tier model of development and sort of 6-dimensional correlates with that is sort of what is needed to make sense of the complexity of this process in any sort of sophisticated way. And it's essentially because we can make these maps that we do and will, and it's exciting to try to make inroads on it. So matter, in some ways, seems to be the ground of all of existence. Unlike the more ancient traditions that supply the notion of sort of something metaphysical, matter goes all the way up and correlates with the other dimension perspectives. But even at matter, there's a sort of dimensionality to it, even though it's a seemingly something of a singular dimensionality to it. In other words, even though it seems to have, shape and size, its perspective in some ways is unidimensional. It is bound up with its own, physical state. So in some ways, it's not very useful or helpful to try to think of it having any sort of interior reality to it. I don't think. But there is, I believe, at the same time, sort of subtle reflections or fractal reflections of that to which it's going to become more interiorized as this process of evolution increases. In other words, it has sort of the groundwork for this. And so we can look at how those early physical processes got working and how they stacked on top of each other to get a better idea of future systems, because it is the very ground for which all of what's to come does. And what we're seeing, in other words, with that is just the housing for higher dimension perspectives in some ways. Better perspective taking capabilities. And so when you look at the second tier, it has the ground of the first tier. It's using that, but it has a new sort of central drive to it, which is sort of a vital life drive, a drive to grow towards the sun, to be healthy and stay away from unhealth. Whereas insentient, or rather just matter, the first tier, doesn't seem to really have that drive very much. It's encoded in some ways into it, but it's in a very primitive way, because it has a fractal suggestion of it. And it seems as development happens, there's 25% of the higher that's sort of instituted in the lower of the next higher stage or tier. And then the third major dimension perspective is when time sort of seems to come online, but the time is instituted in the now, and so you can say that it's in some ways not bound in time, but in other ways it is. And that's the first time that a self recognizes an object, and so it itself recognizes its objecthood. So in that way, when we start to look at this, it's as Stephen Hawking sort of posited, that the higher dimensions are sort of curled up to the perspective of the being, or the dimension perspective from which the higher dimension has come. So, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th dimensions for most people would be curled up because we don't have the dimension perspective capacities to witness what those dimension perspectives actually are. So the third dimension, although it's sort of beginning to interact in time, 2-second memories or whatever, they have some sort of now presence. When you get into reptiles, it's pretty established. There's a pretty strong now sense, and that allows them to be very reactive and impulsive and able to, survive or fight or flight. Whereas the vital life doesn't really have that direct reactivity. It has a proto-reactivity, but it's not its focus. It's pretty inert in its standing. that's the tricky part with this. If it's right, there's all these simultaneous gestures of many things going on at once, but try to look at the primary focus of the capacities and how that relates to the other major dimension perspectives themselves. So I'm saying that there's 6 of them you have to look at simultaneously to try to coordinate how they all of them work. So within the third major dimension perspective, we're trying to correlate its own vitality, which is second dimension perspective, and its own physiological system, so that the reptilian brainstem is at play here, or the neural nets in fish and these sorts of things. So when you get neural nets online, how does that reflect itself in sentience, and what does that mean in relation to its own vitality and its impulsivity and these sorts of things, ability to react? And then when we get into the fourth dimension perspective, I'm suggesting that we add a new layer of, then we get the past, and then the past is, it has an effect on one's experience of the present, whereas, fish had genetic coding that starts essentially with life, vital life. See, the vital life allows genetic coding so that it can redo what was. A genetic code allows the salmon to, quote unquote, remember where the stream is to get back to spawn. But it's not really a remembering, it's a coding, more or less, that's genetically ingrained. But there's a similitude with the fourth dimension perspective, because the sentient being actually has now a memory with the mammalian limbic system, or the paleo-mammalian brain, and this allows for that being, it seems, to digest psychically or internally things that have gone by, and then adapt its behavior in the moment. So it has the access of now and the past, and this allows a bonding capacity, because how it interacts can be augmented moment to moment with its historical understanding, but it doesn't yet have the capacity to predict into the future. It's not a tool maker in that sense, which comes online with the fifth dimension perspective, in my opinion, which humans seem to have. So now the fifth dimension perspective is essentially science. It's the ability to make reality, which is exactly causal prediction, or the prediction of the future. So humans have waking, dreaming, deep sleep, and the deep sleep seems to correlate with the notion of causality. I can bring into existence, but it also seems to have a sort of reflection of the capacity to make object of things. So there seems to be a bit of a confusion in integral theory that as present between the capacity to make object of things and science and actual physical things, but they're different dimension perspectives. The physical thing is the first dimension perspective. It's the total bounding up of a physiological thing, which is matter. This is the fifth major dimension perspective, which allows the mind to actually make object of, or manipulate, or predict into the future how that thing can and would change if things happen. And so in that sense it's objective or scientific. But even the traditional notion of objective scientific is sort of the fifth step in the fifth perspective. There's that whole thing goes back, and you can look at what the third perspective of the fifth dimension would be, which is sort of a more reptilian kind of science. In other words, it's a science bound up with oneself, how a subject makes sense of objects, whereas science proper is how an objective observer makes sense of objects. So the subjective perspective is attempted to be eliminated so that you could be objective, and so you make double-blind tests and these sorts of things to try to establish sort of empiricism. And then the sixth major dimension perspective, is the attempt at witnessing the unfolding of this entire process in its whole six-dimensionality, so that it's the first time that you have the capacity to make sense of how these things all functionally fit, because it itself is interobjective. You see, the third, fourth, fifth, and sixth perspectives seem to parallel the quadrants, although I'm suggesting that the upper right, lower right are a bit, need to be tweaked a little bit in their definitions. So the upper left, is that subjectivity, that experience of subjectivity. The lower left is the experience of intersubjectivity. The upper right is the experience of objectivity, and the lower right is the experience of interobjectivity. And that is the perspective of the dimension perspective experience. So the upper right isn't that physiological correlate. That's the first dimension perspective. So you need 6 to really make sense of this, in other words, as I've noted. The 6th major dimension perspective is the functionally fitting process, the lower right, techno-industrial mode, but now integrated into a cell system. How this all unfolds within a cell system, if that makes any sense. It's kind of convoluted.